Welcome, everyone. We're just letting the room fill in, and we'll get started right on the hour. Oh,
Great.
so 11 o'clock, or my time, 2 o'clock East Coast. So we still have people entering, but we're gonna get started soon. So I'm gonna hand it over to JP.
Well, thank you very much. Welcome to this panel organized by the Economic Sociology section of the American Sociological Association on the crisis at the Treasury. I really want to thank Sarah Quinn for putting this together. This is a really terrific panel and a very timely conversation about the events that we've been experiencing and observing over the last couple of weeks. I also want to thank you all for joining us today. This is being streamed, and I will start recording also now for others who might want to watch the discussion later on. So we have an outstanding panel, and I hope that this panel will lead to a very insightful conversation. The settings on this Zoom call are such that you can ask questions through the chat. Those questions will be visible to the co-hosts, which include the panelists. So if you have any questions, please raise them there. We'll have about 30, 40 minutes of presentations by our two panelists. We might be joined by a third at some point. But if you have questions again, please let us know through the chat. We are joined by two really incredible and unique experts, Elizabeth Pop Berman and Abraham Newman. I want to cede the floor to them because they are the experts, and we will start with Abraham Newman, professor in the School of Foreign Service and Government, a department at Georgetown University. He is, of course, co-author of the amazing Underground Empire, How America Weaponized the World Economy, a very timely reading for for what is going on. So, Abraham, please.
Great. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm gonna share my screen and use some slides to help the conversation along. So first, I think the question everybody's asking is, what is Doge up to? What is Musk's plan? And what I'd like to do briefly is just um, kind of summarize, connecting the dots, point out some risks, and then what are some solutions that are happening already that also we should keep pushing. The first thing is I would just like to stress that I don't think it's only about the Treasury. So if I put up on the slide a bunch of different data sources that the Musk team is identifying, it's, OPM, which is all about personnel, US GSA, which is about operations, IT, US Treasury, of course, but also HHS. We've also seen them trying to get access to USAID servers. And so there is a general effort by this group in order to get access and potentially to change the information architectures of the US government. So what I like to do is just use my own research, which is not about the US government, but for about a decade, I've been studying how governments, especially the US government, use complex information systems in order to coerce their adversaries. And I'd hope to use these lessons to help us think about, well, what is Musk doing in the domestic space?
Hey,
So the first thing is just everybody has kind of a general image of the world. Oh, JP, did you want to say something?
yeah, one quick thing. I think your PowerPoint is showing the presenter view right now, so
Oh,
maybe, yeah, thank
mm,
you.
it doesn't. I'm fine with it.
Okay.
Doesn't really matter. Let's see. No, use slideshow. Oh, there I go. Okay. So somewhere in your head, you have this vision of how the world works that is just very complex. And it seems unmanageable. And we have stories about this. Probably the most kind of famous one is, Thomas Friedman. He had this book, The World is Flat. He had an article in the 1990s that says we live in a world that's not a wall, but a web. He was talking about the World Wide Web. And it's a vision of how decision making functions that says it's very decentralized. And we've heard that in response to the Trump administration's coming that, well, the US has federalism, we have a very decentralized system, markets are very decentralized. And what I want to first do is just say that there are key infrastructures in the global economy, but also in our national system that actually look very different than this caricature. And I'm just going to give you a very banal example. Anybody that's flown Delta ends up in Atlanta. Now, that's great if you like Coca-Cola products, but otherwise, if there's bad weather in Atlanta, you're traveling from Caracas to Cancun and you're stuck there. This structure of a complex system is not just about airlines. It's about global finance. It's about the internet. If you look at your pocket in your phone, it's it's really controlled by one or two companies, Apple or Google. The chip is made by one or two companies, TSMC or Samsung. And if you made a financial transaction, it'd go through one or 10 countries. There are these infrastructures in the way complex systems function in order for them to be efficient. And most of the time, we don't think about them for a second because we just think they're about getting the trains there on time. There are, kind of organizations like SWIFT, the SWIFT system, which connects banks globally. It's like an encrypted email server. These things, for decades, they went unnoticed because people didn't care about them. But then after 9/11, the US government started to weaponize these infrastructures in order to assert their preferences. And what I want you to kind of think about is that web is not really, we've been kind of we've been led down a kind of a cul-de-sac to think that that's about decentralization. Because at the center of any web is a predator. It's an organization or some actor that wants to use the web to centralize information and resources. And in our story, in our book, Underground Empire, that Henry and I wrote, we're talking about how the US government uses that. The networks of the global economy are used to centralize information and then in order to use that to coerce our adversaries. So what can that tell us about what is Musk up to? It's all right now just being reported. So a lot of the things I'm going to mention are just what's being suspected. But I think from what we know at the international level, we can see very clearly the potential risks. So I'm going to move from kind of like connecting the dots now to the risks. The first in our research, we talk about the panopticon effect, which is, this was Jeremy Bentham. He came up with this, he was a utopian philosopher. They love to come up with a lot of utopian crazy things. His was the perfect prison. But the idea was you build a circular prison, you put one guard in the center, everybody feels watched, whether they are actually being watched or not. And Foucault, he took that and he said, then we enforce the rules on ourselves because we feel like we're being watched. And you can easily imagine how once the Doge team has access to the personnel records of the entire federal government, once they have the records of everybody's social security numbers, their bank account information, you quickly start to have that feeling. And at least from the initial reporting, we see this kind of action in play. The second is the choke point effect. This is the idea that, you cut people off of or out of certain interactions. Here, this is the bridge from Colombia to Venezuela. It's a very physical example of this kind of choke point. But the same idea can happen in these IT systems that the Doge people are attempting to gain access to and potentially control. And here we saw today in the New York Times, there was reporting that there was an effort to freeze out payments to certain agencies. This is a very typical choke point type strategy. And so in addition to just monitoring and making us feel like we should be regulated, it's also cutting us off from certain access to funds. But the third question is, whose interest is this for, these actions? And that's why I think we really need to be concerned, because it's not simply the federal government or the collective. There's a certain group of actors, and we don't know what their intentions are. Where with the civil service, or when you think about running the trains on time with the air traffic, kind of examples, we know it's about efficiency. But even though the guise is about efficiency, we get reporting, which then raises question marks about what is the real intention of this. Is Elon Musk trying to create efficiency by eliminating the USAID department, or is it because there's conflicts of interest because that agency had been investigating him? Moreover, if you give this panopticon view to an actor that has economic interests, then you have to be concerned that that information will be used in order to funnel benefits to a group of loyalists rather than the society at large. And so you could think of, just even on a competitive dynamic, it changes the level playing field because it gives an information advantage to a certain cadre of people that others don't have access to. The final risk that I want to flag is just the potential for accidents. You have a small group of untrained engineers engaging with a system that processes trillions of dollars and manages millions of people's employment. And their, at least reporting suggests that changes are being made to that system. Now, this is being disputed by the Trump administration, but at least if Nathan was here, I know he has done some reporting, which suggests that there is actual servers are being linked into these systems. It's not just read-only access, but it's actually manipulating. And we know if you go beyond the Treasury case in the Office of Personnel Management, they are definitely using the system to send out notices to people. It's not just about reading, it's also about interacting. And so that can lead to simple things like payments start to fall by the wayside, but those are real people's lives. We're not just talking about economic activity, somebody's cell phone stops working. It's people's ability to process their medical payments are not happening. And so if that happens at a system-wide scale, you could see really adverse consequences for our society. So let me just end my part of the conversation, which what am I trying to do, or what do I hope people get from this, is first, just connect the dots. It's a very simple story that I think Henry and I tell at the international level, and we see this happening domestically. The plumbing, those basic infrastructures like IT systems, they're political. Most of the time, they're getting the trains running, but if you decide to use them as a political weapon, they can have very adverse consequences. And something like these stories that just talk about locking people out of computers, they're not getting at the fundamental process that is in motion, which is taking that, if you remember that map at the beginning, creating that centralized structure where there's that hub in Atlanta. And if you just control that hub, then you can really control the system at large. And so we need to be telling a story of why that is so dangerous, both for political reasons, but also for people's just safety. The second is that there are ongoing lawsuits in order to constrain this activity. There was actually just a ruling today which limited to read-only access to in the Treasury Department. I just want to caution that, first of all, we need to keep pressure on the system to enforce such rulings, but also, at least from my reading, several of the threats are not really mitigated by a read-only access system, because you could still get the kind of panopticon effects. You can still use that information in order to get conflict of interest type leverage over different actors. And so we need to think about how do you mitigate those risks as well. The fourth point is that I think we still need to think about, there's a larger, it's not even just about Treasury, it's all these other data banks that are also being accessed. And so we need to put pressure on political representatives as well as, I think, financial representatives, make this a consumer issue that companies, they have a stake in as well. And the final thing is, I think, is, making this an issue at the local level, saying, newspapers need to take action. These are just some of the kind of, I'm always looking for, like, how can we activate people as well as feel distressed? And I think that there are a series of actions that people can take every day, and we've already seen action happening because of that. And with that, I will stop sharing and pass over the baton.
Thank you very much. That was brilliant as expected. So we now have also on this panel Elizabeth Pop Berman, Richard H. Price Professor of Organization Studies and by courtesy Sociology at the University of Michigan, and author, of course, of Thinking Like an Economist, How Efficiency Replaced Equality in U.S. Public Policy. Beth, the floor is yours.
Thanks, JP, and thank you and Sarah for organizing this very timely panel. And I really appreciate the way that New Babe set things up out front, because I think it really provided a helpful conceptual framework for thinking about why and in what ways some of this infrastructure matters. I'm going to talk at a little bit more of a basic level, and maybe that is too basic for people, but my sense is from talking to people this week that this is something that just the mechanics of are pretty hard to convey. And I think spelling those out is very useful. And also that even if this is something that some of the folks in this room are familiar with, that it's useful to think about how do we communicate this to other people who might not be particularly interested in the Treasury payment system and have a hard time figuring out why this is something that they should care about. Right. So I think just at a baseline level, like, first of all, right, what has happened here? So we've got Elon Musk and his team have found their way into having access to the Treasury payment system, which is the system that actually makes the payments for the federal government. And so it does this for 90% of the federal government. It's everything but the Defense Department and the Postal Service. And so they are processing the payments for $6 trillion a year. And so that is more than a fifth of the entire economy. So just to give you a sense of scale of just how much this actually is. And, and this is something that is a routine plumbing kind of process, right? The metaphor people keep using is this is like a spigot that they might be able to turn on and off, but this is just the plumbing that we don't usually think about. So this is not the place where normally there are controls for fraud, but this is not usually the place where people are making decisions about, is this good spending? Is this bad spending? Like, should we be doing this as a place to be more efficient? This is just normally routine. And it's normally controlled by civil servants, right? So it's normally controlled by apolitical actors. It's never before been something that's been kind of actively managed in this way by a representative of a political figure. And so where we are now, right? So Musk's team again, this may be pause now, definitely has had read access. Most of the reporting seems to have said they've had write access at some point. There have been some conflicts about that. And this means in theory that they can stop payments, right? So they can halt a particular payment that the federal government is making. And so if you think of all the things that the government pays, right, that's everything from Social Security to Medicare and Medicaid to money that goes through agencies like NSF. It's to Head Start, to community health centers, to all kinds of things. And and I think one thing to be concerned about is that Musk has made it very clear that he would like to be able to turn things on and off in this relatively granular kind of way. And so this is nominally in the service of making government more efficient, but also, it's also been very clear that Musk has also articulated a desire to come in and sort of, shut things down so that they're not going to work in the same way again, right? To fundamentally change how government works. So where we are right now, and again, I taught at 11:30 and came out after class and had to look at the news really quickly. And I think the temporary restraining order came out a few hours ago. But so there is now, I think until Friday, a temporary restraining order that says they're not allowed to have access. And so, in some ways, I think, again, like Abe said, the cat is already out of the bag. The data is, that piece of it, at least, the data has been breached. I think so the question will be, does this hold and do they respect it? But so why, if Musk and his team have this kind of access, so why is this a bad thing? And I think there's three big reasons here. One is the data itself, right? So there have been reports that Musk's team has been using private servers. Again, as it mentioned, there's a lot of commercial value to this data. It's got people's social security numbers in it. It's got their bank accounts. It has incredible commercial value. Musk has a lot of interest in developing financial products. He recently made a partnership with Visa to try to turn X into a sort of everything payments platform. This kind of data is stuff that could give him a substantial competitive edge. And so there's just a lot of room for how it might be commercially useful. In addition to the part where it can potentially be used in corrupt ways, where people who are allied are given access to information that other people do not have access to. So I think that's one that is a clear issue, but also hard to get people that excited about. I think everybody's so used to having their privacy broken. We all get these notices a couple of times a year of the data breach here or there. So while it's really important, I'm not sure it's the best way of communicating the importance of what's going on. I think the second big reason that we should be concerned here is the possibility of breaking things. And so this is only the case if they have write access and not just if it's read-only access. But these are systems that are built on servers that were put together in the 1960s. They're written in COBOL. They're extremely complicated. People have a lot of very domain-specific expertise in learning how to use them. And they are the infrastructure that so much of the US is built upon. And so what we've got is young and presumably very bright but engineers, but with very little no domain-specific experience, are going in. And again, there have been reports that they have been actively changing things. Things are easy to break. They're not always easy to unbreak. And I think that people need to understand what potential consequences of things breaking in that way are. And I do think it is very imaginable that they could break things in a way that made it difficult or impossible to process payments for some extended period of time. And I think the thing to keep in mind here, right, is that again, Musk's philosophy is move fast and break things. That is one thing if you're at Twitter, and if it goes down for a few hours, the consequences are not that great to the world. But to kind of think about the impact of this, right? Medicare, Medicaid are a third of all federal or a third of all health spending in the US. So if for some reason Medicare or Medicaid payments can't go out to hospitals, within a week or so, you've got a situation in which hospitals can no longer pay their bills. And so you have this, because the government is so large, even though we don't see all of it all the time, any kind of inability to pay has this huge downstream consequence. I think the other one that's really important to think about is that the US government pays out interest on Treasury bonds. And so all the bondholders who are out there, the reason that people buy US Treasury bonds is because they're backed by the full faith and credit of the US government, and they're considered to be extremely low risk. So if there is a pause for some reason because the system breaks and it's not possible to pay those, then the question is what actually, it's hard to know what the consequences of that are. It would be financially, never before seen event. It's easy to imagine financial markets freezing up, panic occurring. I mean, I think, I think the Fed is supposed to have plans in place to backstop these kinds of situations, but we're really in uncharted territory. So I think, that kind of situation is something where you could see a real financial panic and kind of again, because of the way these systems are networked, a much broader, right, global level financial crisis. But the third one, in case you're not worried enough yet, is actually the one that I'm personally most concerned about. And that is the potential that you can use this kind of ability to turn things on and off to implement an authoritarian agenda. And I think, just to kind of remind everybody of Civics 101 here, right? Article 1 of the Constitution says that Congress has the power of spending. And so, Congress decides what's going to be spent. The executive branch is in charge of spending it. And there has long been, so the idea of impoundment, which is when the executive branch does not spend what Congress has appropriated, is something that presidents did a little bit for a long time. They would sort of have fights with Congress over it. It is something that was done historically, but it tended to be kind of around the margins. And in the early 1970s, President Nixon decided to start to impound things more aggressively, and it created a big conflict with Congress, which traditionally has very jealously guarded its power of the purse. And in response, Congress passed the Impoundment Act of 1974, which basically says you can't do this. So even little bits, it's just, there's a process through which the president can go back and ask Congress to spend money, or not, if they cannot spend money, but it is very limited and very constrained. And so if we're in a situation where Musk potentially wants to ask people to stop particular pieces of spending, right, in order to carry out a political agenda, I think one question is, what does that actually mean? And the other question is, what does that process look like, and how does it come up against legal limits? And if we kind of talk about what could it mean, what could it look like, why would that be bad piece of it? I think, perhaps those of us in universities have felt this stronger than people in some other spaces just from day one, that there is a very aggressive top-down effort to weaponize the government, to prevent funding to ideas that are regarded as ideologically objectionable. So, we saw this with DEI on day one. We saw this with trans people on day one. We saw this with mentions of, scrubbing websites of mentions of race and gender and so forth. And, having the ability to turn off money in order to execute a political agenda is a pretty scary thing. And it is, something that would go well beyond just, oh, you lost your NSF grant, right? I think worst case scenario, you can imagine this being used to turn off money to states that don't comply with the administration's orders. And so if you have states who are doing things in opposition to the administration, like not allowing their police forces to be used to support ICE operations, you can imagine being in a situation where it is possible to have somebody say, we're not going to let your funds go through unless that actually happens. And I want to make it clear, right? Like, this is all clearly illegal. This may be like I hope this is, I hope this is the apocalyptic scenario. But I also think it would be very remiss of us not to acknowledge this kind of scenario. And I think that brings us to the question of, how do we think about, how this gets stopped, right? And so, the good thing is that this is running up against all kinds of different laws, right? So there's the Impoundment Control Act, there's the Administrative Procedures Act. The suit that was brought today was on the basis of the Privacy Act, I believe. And so, and so the legal argument for stopping this was that government employees have a right to the privacy of their data, and these are not people who've been cleared to use it. I think what I'm going to really be paying attention to in the next few days is to what extent are the courts, uh, what extent are the court's orders respected, right? And I think we've already seen signs that that's a little bit uneven. I think when the spending freeze reversal came in, it was initially not super clear. I mean, most of the spending freeze was reversed, but there's been places where it hasn't quite happened. It took a while to happen at NSF for them to release the funds again. There's still reports of Head Start centers not being funded. There were some reports yesterday of some community health centers that were not receiving their funds. So there's a question of whether that's going to be respected. And the other question is, even if it is respected, how does the Supreme Court end up interpreting this stuff? So is the Supreme Court, I think at least one interpretation of what's going on is that, the administration is hoping that some of this will get carried to the Supreme Court and that the Supreme Court will overturn the Impoundment Act, which would create a lot more discretion in making these decisions about what to turn on and off. And so, that's the other thing that I'm certainly going to be paying a lot of attention to is how are the courts actually interpreting these cases as they go through. So, yeah, I mean, so I think I've been going for a bit. My last thing I will just say is I do think thinking about how to stop it is a good note to end on. Obviously, there are a lot of people who are filing lawsuits all over the place in order to try to challenge different pieces of this and to ensure that it at least it experiences some barriers in the courts. I think this is the time for massive public pressure, right? And I think in part because this is a story that is kind of technical and kind of boring, and you have to take a while to explain even like what's going on to people. Particularly in a news cycle where something new and loud is being thrown out every 15 minutes, it's very hard to keep it on people's radar. And so I think just the act of making sure people don't stop paying attention to this, kind of understanding what's potentially at stake here, and that this is not one that can be easily walked back if this is something that we allow to happen, is really critical. And so, obviously, I think Democrats in Congress have the power to at least delay things as much as possible by just sort of, stopping doing procedural things by doing public kind of demonstrations of opposition. But I do think there's also room that there are also, that Elon Musk is not an especially popular figure, and that includes not being overwhelmingly popular among Republicans. I think there's a substantial slice of Republicans who don't love the idea of Musk having this degree of control of the government. And so I think there is, so I would call your red state senators as well. Don't hold off just because you think they might not be supportive. And yeah, and finally, I think the final thing is just keep talking to people, right? Tell the people who are in your lives who are not paying all that much attention to politics of why this is important and what's at stake, and try to get people to understand why this matters. Because I do think it's one that's very easy to stop paying attention to kind of let pass under the the boring sounding heading of the Treasury payment system. And I think that's been changing over the last few days, which is great. But I do think we need to keep the pressure on. So I'll stop with that.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. So we have, again, really, really wonderful contributions. I'm going to start with a couple of questions or a question. The first thing is, of course, I really do appreciate both the call to explain boring things to people, because a lot of the world is actually based on very, very boring, arcane and technical things. And I think that part of the work that we need to do is explain those in a way that showcases their importance for everything. I also think that this take of consumer advocacy that Abe presented is very interesting and might be one of the effective ways for doing things around this. I am a catastrophist though, and I do have like this very, very sort of ingrained fear that institutions can erode incredibly rapidly, and institutions are very fragile. That's also the case of central banks and money more generally. At the core, these things are based on forms of trust that can evaporate very quickly and that can erode in a matter of weeks, days, months. We've seen it in the past in certain moments in history, recent history and not so recent history. And you can foresee, or you can at least think of scenarios that could be very catastrophic. Like, for example, to Beth's point, could the government just stop interest payments on the $770 billion in Treasury bills that China has? That's a possibility. It's completely feasible given what is going on. And of course, this would have cascading effects in the global economy. It would probably really destroy the global financial system as we know it. So the question, I know that we're in really uncharted waters. I know that asking sociologists and political scientists to predict things is not necessarily a guarantee of getting the predictions that will happen, but is this irreversible? What in this is irreversible? What is broken forever, and what do you think can still be repaired?
I don't know, Beth, are you, where, how should we
Sure.
tag
Yeah.
team?
No, why don't you go ahead and then we can just speak in turn, I guess.
Great. I mean, I'm very interested in the consumer angle of activating people. Call your banks, call your insurance companies, call, your retirement accounts. These are systems that should be safe. And there should be basic cybersecurity protections that the federal government can guarantee. I don't see those guarantees being made by the federal government. Things like, private servers being plugged into, like that's very worrisome from just a very basic security standpoint. And so, make the companies be your advocates. And I think that that's a very, an easy message and a way to mobilize not just your own voice, but then the voice of these very powerful institutions in our society, the financial, gatekeepers. And they also have a huge interest. I mean, as Beth said, if there is a cascade of failure, they're on the line for that. So, get those CEOs interested in that. Um, in terms of um, you know, what is the genie out of the bottle, of these things? I am very concerned about that, um, because any other administration, if this is allowed, then any other administration would say, well, why couldn't I do that too? If that's, I would like a line item veto. I'd like to surveil my opponents. After Watergate, what we had was a cross-party norm building effort to say these things are not acceptable, and we agree basically to de-escalate on both sides. Or at least, some people would disagree. Some people would say the Gingrich Revolution, basically threw that all out. But, at least in the wake of Watergate, there was a cross-party consensus. And I think at least in political science, the work, Dan Ziblatt, for example, he's done a lot of work, which is like the norm breakers have to be the ones to rebuild the norms. It's in his work, it's always about the mainstream conservative elements. They have to then ostracize and isolate the radical elements in order to create a firewall against these types of norm incursions. And, I think it's interesting. You see it happening in Germany today. This debate between the center right party and the far right German party, and whether they can collaborate or not. And there's a lot of people that are these demonstrations saying you need the firewall, you have to do that, and we'll see what happens. But I think we will need a concerted engagement across party to reestablish confidence in these basic institutions once this emergency that we have right now is over.
Yeah, and just to kind of build on that, I mean, I think the one other thing I would think about on the sort of the consumer pressure side is that at least so far, it doesn't seem like the markets are really pricing in this kind of risk. And, again, I think the more that businesses, and banks and financial institutions in particular are getting the sense that this is a thing that people are concerned about, it's going to start to change their perception of, oh, well, this might be a long tail risk, but it is a risk. And then, once you start to have consequences in the financial market, I mean, we do know that Trump pays attention to the financial markets, and and I think that's a place where you can imagine uh, positive cascading effects, right? Effects that led to internal decisions that would sort of walk some of this back. Yeah, and in terms of what we can back off of, I mean, I do think there may be parts of it that are right, like the data may be gone. Like, I don't think we know, but it's possible that piece is not possible to walk back. If right, like I guess the best case scenario is that the lawsuits are very, the decisions are all very clear all the way to the top of the Supreme Court that this is not okay, and that even if there are some additional ability, even if the presidency has some additional ability to impound funds, that there has to be a much more, limited defined process for doing that. I think the best case is that we're a little worse off than we were before, right? That another norm has been broken, there's less barrier to somebody else trying it again. But that we see more or less the system holds. So that's the good version of what could happen.
Great, thanks. I like the good version. I think it's better than the catastrophes that I'm sort of playing in my head. I'll start asking some folks to ask their questions. They've shared quite a few in the chat now. And I'll actually start with Sarah.
Hi, I'm actually going to sneak in an announcement too. I just want to let people know that Nathan Tankis was going to join us, but he got pulled away. He's very busy reporting. So we're sorry that in the end he couldn't join us. But I really want to thank Abe and Beth for having such a clear distillation of the issues with these complex systems. It's a thing we really need right now. So my question is, for those of us who are interested in following this story, one of the questions is where to get reliable news on it. So I'm wondering what some of your favorite or preferred news sources at this moment are. Who do you think is really doing a good job of explaining what's happening and the stakes of what's happening?
Yeah, I can just start with that. I mean, Nathan Tankis, who is unfortunately not here, writes a sort of a newsletter called Notes on the Crisis. And his reporting has been some of the most comprehensive, and he's broke some of these stories. The mainstream publication that's been doing the best reporting so far, I think, is Wired, which again, I think there's been tech publications have been doing better with this earlier, maybe because this is kind of a set of actors who they are used to covering. A smaller outlet that I think has been breaking some stories that haven't been broken elsewhere is 404 Media, which is another tech-focused smaller site. And I think that in the last couple of days, I think the New York Times and the Washington Post are clearly doing very in-depth reporting, but I also think that they're often not like sometimes the text is more fully conveying the stakes than the headlines do. Sometimes I think the text itself is a little uh, uh, framed in a way that does not, to me, convey what the potential risks are. But those are what my go-tos have been.
I would just second what Beth said, and I would just add, like, I think it's important to check out things like The Guardian or other countries' analysis of the same problem. So, like, The Guardian yesterday, that the headline was "How the World's Richest Man Laid Waste to the US Government." It's just a different, like, the New York Times might say, in efficiency exercises, Musk, might cross some lines or something like that. It's like, so for whatever reason, US media is being very careful on how it analyzes this, where I think foreign media is often giving us a more, for those people that want a quick take of like what is happening, it's easier to discern that.
Great. There's a question by, let's see, Dan Immergluck. Would you like to ask it? If you're still on the call, Dan?
Uh, Sure. So my question is, given the systemic risk that you all have articulated so well, and given the limits of pressure on Congress, I have been trying to bring up the potential to appeal to Chairman Powell and other Fed governors, who, of course, don't like to be seen as political actors, but of course are. And, they are charged above all with, as well as handling inflation, of addressing systemic risk to the financial institutions and the financial system. And I don't see Powell as a very brave figure, but I also don't think he will be hurt that much if he's forced out. He may be forced out anyway. And it seems like now's the time to put pressure on him just to say things, not even to do things, because what he says affects markets, and what other Fed governors say. They've already been talking about the tariffs as posing risks. There's no reason that they can't talk about this other than political courage. So I appreciate any feedback on that. I have seen Fed governors speak out on issues like, the subprime crisis and other things.
I don't think that's a bad idea. I think it's the question of how to motivate the Fed to speak out on these issues. I think, you could imagine a rally at the Fed, being like, save our economy, or, like that kind of a simple slogan. But I also think the Fed is often reacting to what industry leaders are concerned about. And they're, things like the credit rating agencies, they're the ones that are the motivator for a lot of what the Fed is thinking about. And so, efforts to flag these issues to the credit rating agencies, I think, is important. I also think one of my concerns is that you get a Hungary-like outcome, which is that political resources are channeled into a certain segment of the economy, and that other segments of the economy, other actors, are left to kind of atrophy. And so there, I think it's important to, wherever people have connections into industry sectors, is to flag, like, there's a reason industry likes property rights. They like the rule of law. They like stability because it creates a level playing field. Once you disturb that kind of level playing field, then it can lead to insider-outsider dynamics, which can create, economic trouble. The stock market might not crash because some people will benefit tremendously from that. But some actors within the political or economic system will lose. And so also kind of raising that awareness is also, I think, important.
That's good. I don't have anything to add to that.
Great. There's a question also by Sarah Curran. Sarah?
Sure. Actually, it was a comment. Thank you so much for organizing this, everyone. I'm a demographer. So I thought I would just mention that I think there are some lessons to be learned from the census fight in 2019-20 that you might consider as you're thinking through this particular case. So in the Wayback Machine, 2019-2020, we had a real concerted effort by this Trump 1 administration to to really inject major problems with the census, including asking a citizenship question and trying to get into census data to identify people's status, independent of asking the question. So there was very concerted effort to maintain the integrity of the census. And one of the ways in which that was done was with internal resistance from people at the, down one level from the main leadership, in addition to major legal filings and amity briefs and the like. And I only mention it because I think that this new version this new administration learned from that experience. And I think there's something to be, think about what they learned, but also the court's ruling on census privacy and the integrity of the census there might be something in there that's worth investigating. I don't know, but I'm reminded this is on a order of magnitude greater, perhaps than that. But the integrity, people identify strongly with the census as being a private data collection effort. So it could be that you might use that analogy in communicating what's going on here. Thank you. Yeah, and I just also I think that's a great suggestion, and it's probably really useful to think about what worked and what didn't work in various phases in the first administration. Phil Rocket was a political scientist who has a book coming out on the 2020 census. It's called Counting Like a State, but a lot of it is about kind of the state-federal interaction during that census fight. And I think, if we're in the position where some of what we're seeing is new kinds of ways of trying to figure out how to use the federal government to shape or limit what state governments are doing, I think that could be an interesting place to look for ideas as well.
There's a couple of questions that are similar to some extent. One is, what specifically might I ask my bank if I don't receive payment directly from the federal payment system? So what happens if your payments don't come through? What do you do? Who do you call? And also, could you say more about how consumers can activate their banks and insurance companies, maybe to do something about this?
I mean, I think if you are not receiving payment, then you really should activate a lot of different channels. You would want to call your congressperson and your senator. I think that they're probably some of your best advocates in this kind of case. There's also the FTC would be another avenue whenever there's any kind of like financial issue that's going wrong. In terms of, so that's all on the back end, if payments are not happening for some reason. But in terms of mobilizing, I think of it as, a strategy where just asking your bank, calling them and saying, what is your plan if something were to go wrong because of Musk's intervention into the payment system? And then they'll I imagine they'll be confused. What do you mean? And you're like, well, I'm worried that this information system is no longer secure, and I want to make sure that you are doing something to prepare for that and to put the onus onto them to reassure you. And I don't want to be I'm a very positive person. I try to stay glass half full. And so I think, none of this has happened yet. And so right now, what we need to do is be defensive. We need to protect ourselves. And this is one way to activate the community, the institutions, to say, how are you protecting us from this? Because this is a very unusual activity that is happening, that there are these people plugging in laptops into government sensitive information systems. And so I would reassure you, there's no evidence yet that any of these things have been happening. But there is evidence that the information is being used, like Musk kind of listed out of, different organizations that he thought were not using money efficiently. The information is being sorted. And so we know that there is activity in these very sensitive spaces. And I think we want to just demand that our institutions are protecting us.
Thank you for that. I think I'm going to let Yvonne go.
Thank you very much. And hi, I've met a lot of you on Twitter, and it's just nice to see your faces. So I have a comment and then I have a question. My comment is that I paid a visit to my senator's local offices yesterday, along with a group from Indivisible, and they were very clear that they want to hear stories from constituents who are having trouble getting their money from. So any kind of benefit, any kind of information. Like there were people in this meeting who could not access like their student loan information. Like the staffers were all over that. They took lots of notes. They made sure people had their contact information to provide more detail. So that's a thing that I would really encourage um, people, like I've been telling my friends, I've been telling my family. So my question is, as I guess what I'm wondering is if people see if there is something that those of us who work in IT and are technology professionals should be, if there's a position that it would help for us to take. I mean, like I know that I am having a very visceral reaction to a lot of this because like many people, I've tried to install software and not gotten the okay to do it for like 6 months. So I feel like there could have been a lot more foot dragging than there really was. But you know, I don't want to judge what people did, but I had like, yes, I'm judging. Um, so yes, that is my question. Like, what do you do you see things that um, those of us who work in tech that it would help for us to ask for publicly or to other organizations, just by virtue of our position?
I'm not sure I have a very full answer to that. I think it's a great question. I mean, obviously, I think, uh, I think any kind of, for large tech companies at least, any kind of internal pressure that's coming from employees would be great to see. I mean, you're not gonna see it, right? But that having that kind of internal pressure of, this is not something that we are on board with. We would like you to use your influence to push back. Maybe Abe has another thought on the sort of like the more outward facing, like what do tech people do in the outward facing way. I will say your point about the stories gave me one other thought as well, because I think that's great. And I think it's challenging because there aren't that many stories of the money, people not getting their money yet, because that's kind of, something that's uh, happening at a very limited or kind of erratic basis. But I think the other place I can imagine, assuming we've got a lot of academics in the audience, is that there are a lot of people who have lost access to the data sets that they rely on to do their jobs. And I don't know if that would be the sort of thing that would also lend itself to a story that, I study this thing that, saves people's lives and the data is now gone. I can also imagine being the kind of thing that would be useful to convey to a representative.
I mean, I would just add that I think the more that the technological community can evaluate and just say in a very simple way how exceptional this is. Because I think there are still a lot of stories in the newspaper which are like, oh, they say they're doing an efficiency audit. And I think it's very clear from anybody with a technical background that this isn't just an efficiency audit. And so, like to have somebody write a story that says like, well, this is what an efficiency audit would look like, and this is what they're doing, and this is not that, or like you're saying, the typical time for a new IT system to be run would be, 6 months in a private sector setting. Do you know what I mean? Like not, it's like, what does the rollout of a new update for, X or Y? And this is what's being done in the government right now, where it's not about making money, it's about protecting people's lives and their welfare. So, I think a technical perspective could be very good at demonstrating the exceptional nature of what is happening, which many journalists, I think, probably, they would welcome that kind of access. I would also just stress in terms of reporting things to political officials, I think there's just a lot of websites that have been taken down that people need in order to communicate with the government. And so that can be another venue, of saying, I'm trying to find out my X or Y, and the whole website is now gone. So documenting that and those difficulties would, I think, also be useful.
So we are unfortunately at time. Some of our guests have to leave. There are awesome questions. One of the questions that I really liked is, should we pay taxes given that all of this is happening? I would say no, but that's a complicated answer. Don't take it as legal advice. Thank you very much for joining us. It was really great having this conversation. Thank you to Abe. Thank you to Beth. Thank you to Sarah. And thank you to everyone who has been working behind the scenes. I hope it was informative, and I hope things change in the future.
Thanks again for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks for a
Bye-bye.
great presentation.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.